do you think you can build super intelligence with a team of 20 people and just like vibes? Or does like the fact that they're worth $32 billion on zero revenue kind of like represent the fact that we've like peaked? Like, is this as bad as it gets?
I mean, you're going to need a hell of a lot of vibes, dude.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Pre-Train Pod. My name is Rich, research scientist in the Bay Area.
And I'm Pierce, AI founder, also based in San Francisco.
Pierce, today I want to talk to you about something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and a lot of our friends in the Bay Area have been thinking about lately.
Oh boy, housing prices.
Weather, the fact that it's rainy, and the fact that there's like a bajillion neolabs in the Bay Area. Actually, maybe just to start off, what is a neolab, Pierce? How would you define a neolab?
It's basically this new age of AI research companies that are trying to push models as their core product, but are outside of the OpenAI, Anthropic, and XAI. So it's basically like the smaller...
And Meta, maybe.
And Meta. Yeah, totally. It's like the non-big tech AI companies. Those are the neolabs.
It's like the way that there used to be FANG. I guess there still is FANG. And now for AI, it's like OpenAI, Anthropic, Meta, and Google. Anything outside of those four is what I would almost consider a neolab at this point, effectively, right?
And it's specifically, I think, an AI company that's trying to ship a model as their core product. You know what I mean? Instead of like dressing it up to be some software as a service that has AI, it's their whole remit is they're going to spin up an API and people are going to use it. That's like more or less what they're doing.
Yeah, exactly. And the reason that these things are so interesting isn't just because they're just another AI company. It's because they've literally raised billions of AI dollars in the last 2 years, number one. And number two, it's like basically all of the staff of these neolabs used to work at OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, or Meta. So something is happening in the Bay Area where talented folks from these big AI labs are moving to these smaller startups. They're raising billions of dollars. What gives, man? It kind of feels like it's like this brave new world out here where a lot of our friends are either starting their own neolabs or working at neolabs. And it's an interesting new sort of like frontier. It's an interesting new development in the AI game. I guess the question is, are any of these neolabs, you think, more like the next Anthropic, like the way that Anthropic was a big upstart in a couple of years ago? Or are these neolabs the next WeWork, like the next thing that seems exciting and then eventually just like collapses and flounders once you actually put scrutiny to it?
I mean, I think it's still way too early to say. I think if I had to maybe backprop why this is happening or why people are interested in it, to me, it's just a reflection that the big labs are really chasing the scaling hypothesis for all that it's worth, right? Like the last few years have really been this morphing of these groups that were really focused on just core R&D. A lot of them didn't really even have engineering teams in the conventional way. Like all their job postings just say technical staff. That's kind of because a large portion of their team were just researchers. You know, it was a bunch of people that were like hacking things together in Jupyter notebooks and like ad hoc training pipelines.
I feel like that's still in vogue, like the member of technical staff.
Yes,
like
it very much is. Yeah, if you're an engineer or you're a researcher, you're kind of all under this umbrella. But the OG, like Frontier Labs a few years ago, if you joined OpenAI, it was more or less a team of just researchers. In fact, I know that a couple people who are really cracked engineers tried to get into OpenAI from our year. And OpenAI was like, hey, we actually only really have spots for PhD researchers. Like we're just not really hiring for engineers. I think that was kind of like the mentality of a lot of these companies when they first got formed. ChatGPT hits, wave of interest and popularity of AI and LLM specifically in the consumer and the enterprise segment. And then before we know it, they're having to bootstrap these engineering teams. And then there becomes this race for the best model that they actually can serve and make revenue off of. And at that point, you're probably not going to fund like super, super risky early stage R&D. You're going to fund, okay, let's double down on the transformer. Let's double down on data because these two things have like worked well enough for us in the past. It feels a little bit too much like, we're going to have to take 5 steps back to take like 10 forward. That's not really that like palatable for these big companies now. So I think that's like the provenance of these upstart companies that are really trying to find new model architectures that might unlock the next wave. If that's like of accuracy, of latency, of efficiency, like actual power efficiency, TBD, I think kind of depends on the company. But like that's my sense of boots on the ground of why neolabs are starting now and why they're actually getting funding.
And I think this all started in October of 2023, or actually November 2023. Do you know what I'm referring to? Do you remember this? The OpenAI
no.
board coup?
Yes. Okay. Sure.
It was almost
2.5 years
two
ago.
and a half years ago. That's right. Yeah. Famously, Sam Altman got ousted for a little bit, for like a day.
Yeah.
There was a rift basically in this company between himself and Ilya, right? Sutskever, who was, I guess, like at the time, the chief
scientist, maybe?
chief scientist potentially. Anyway, so I mean, it basically seemed like what happened at the time was that Sam Altman wanted to take the company into a more aggressive sort of direction to keep producing more and more models trained on more data. And Ilya, and there was this whole contingent at OpenAI who were a little bit more hesitant and who wanted to do a little bit more like safety and analyses of these models before deploying them, kind of started to put the brakes a little bit on Sam. And then there was some sort of like internal rift. And then eventually there was a falling out. Sam was briefly asked for a day before being invited back in. But then upon his return, naturally, I guess Sam wanted to throw the usurpers out of the lab. And then what ended up happening was basically as a result of this rift, a bunch of the former employees of OpenAI went and founded their own companies. And then so since November 2023, in these last 2 years, we've seen kind of this story happen several times where you'll have engineers at OpenAI or Anthropic have some sort of a, maybe not dispute, but some, some different change of direction that they would like to take the company in, create their own lab. And at this point, I think we're now upwards of 20 or 30 Neo labs in the Bay Area that are all competing with one another.
That's just crazy. I mean, this origin story is kind of a tale as old as the frontier labs themselves, right? Like Anthropic actually got started from a bunch of OpenAI researchers.
Yeah, that's
who
right.
said that even back in 2021, OpenAI was kind of going in the wrong direction and they wanted to open up a competitor. So this thing has been like well trodden. I think just the Neo lab of it all is the fact that these companies are not yet that big.
Yeah, totally. And the interesting thing is that I feel like, up until maybe 2 or 3 years ago, the notion that you could just have an upstart company create a foundation model felt so implausible because, it was only the big companies that had access to the required compute and the required data. And the thing that shifted all of a sudden in these last couple of years is VC's ability and desire and like just raw appetite to fund these Neo labs with so much money that they can in fact train their own foundation models. That's why these Neo labs are so interesting, is because they're out of the blocks. They're getting $300 million checks, right? Just from a VC, just to create their own model.
Really just with the team.
No strings attached,
right?
Basically. Yeah, just here is $300 million. Pierce, you and your 5 buddies build me a beautiful foundation model. That's basically the contract that these VCs are signing with these Neo labs. And it's created this whole like ecosystem of different Neo labs competing with each other to build the next big foundation model that can rival OpenAI or Anthropic. Here's a little fun fact for you.
Okay.
The Bay Area funding hit $126 billion in 2025, which is more than half of all global AI funding. It's like 2/3 of any funding in the world for AI has been centralized in the Bay Area.
SF so back, baby.
And here's something that I thought was even more interesting. Of all startup capital, right? All the money going into startups, it's like over 80%, nearly 90% of it is going into AI-based startups, right? It's a wild world out there, dude. It's the wild west of all of these Neo labs in this like arena fighting each other. And we're here kind of like on the outside looking at all of them. And it's unclear where this is going to go. You know what I mean? And so what I want to do today is basically, I want to take a step back. I want to like present the different competitors in this arena. I want to get, your takes on who you think are plausible winners in this game, who you think might be losers, and basically like, what's the selling point of all these different Neo labs? How do they differentiate themselves from each other? And to the extent to which we can like group them into different categories, it'd be fun to try to figure out, who are like the top 5 or 10 and just try to cluster them into these different categories.
Mm-hmm.
So before we do that, here's a question to like get us kind of like teed off. In 1957, there was this company called Fairchild Semiconductor that was, I think, based somewhere probably in like Palo Alto or something like that. And they were one of the first to design like these like flat silicon chips. And out of this company.
But do you know what they were before? Were they circular?
I don't
How
know.
weren't they flat?
Yeah, I don't know, dude.
I guess maybe like if you etch it versus like literally have to construct something physical that takes up the Z-axis real estate.
I
I
mean,
don't know. Just
I don't know,
what a
man.
funny name. Flat semiconductors. Like, of course they have to be flat.
These guys get paid the big bucks, dude. This is above my pay
That's
grade.
sure.
I don't
Sure,
know
fair.
the geometry of these wafers or whatever. But anyway, point
Should
is,
learn EE.
there's this company in the 1950s, right?
Yeah.
They were the first to really put Silicon Valley on the map. And many of the employees of this company left to create companies like Intel, AMD, even like Sequoia in some sense is a derivative of this original company of Fairchild Semiconductors. We have this like model here by looking at Fairchild Semiconductor of a company that clearly went off and created basically like the whole Silicon Valley industry. I guess the question that I want to talk about today is like, do you think OpenAI was basically like the Fairchild Semiconductor or will be the Fairchild Semiconductor of the AI world? Like, are basically many of the future companies that will arise in the next 10 years be in some sense like the children of OpenAI, and OpenAI will eventually kind of like splinter and like not really be a thing anymore? Or is this going to be more like Google, where, you know, like a lot of folks have tried to compete with Google, but Google is still Google, right?
They're still top dog.
They've been the top dog this whole time. And like they're not going anywhere.
Yeah. I mean, I guess we'll have to see how it plays out. It does definitely feel like OpenAI is both in this Fairchild mold as well as maybe in like the PayPal mafia mold. You know, like the people that were really early on in PayPal had the same kind of origin story. Like, you know, PayPal was obviously a success in its own right, but it's mostly because of what these people did afterwards that we
Totally.
typically know about them. It wasn't because of PayPal, but you know, it's like Thiel, it's Musk, it's a laundry list of people. It does kind of feel like OpenAI was that place, both for the current breed of frontier labs as well as like these neo labs. It does kind of feel like they all got their start within like the really tight team of the like original research group that was at OpenAI, because most of these people were at OpenAI back in like 2018, 2017, either like founding members or not. And I don't know. Like, I think that part of that premise assumes that OpenAI won't make it, because Fairchild, we don't really know the names of Fairchild. We know the names
Totally.
of what happened after.
Yeah.
You know, Stripe is an example in which there was such talent density in the early days. A lot of those people have gone off to do other things, but Stripe is doing just fine. And these other companies are also doing just fine. It's like the pie was kind of big enough for both of them. I think it's a little early to see exactly where this OpenAI game plays out. But I do think that there will probably be one winner of the like really large model game, and there will probably be a winner or a few winners that are able to diversify on some other basis besides just like accuracy at all costs, that can find some niche domain within this like long tail of neolabs. So yeah, whether or not that is Fairchild or Google, I don't know. It might be like some new nexus. But yeah, I think it's certainly fair to say that like what they do afterwards, especially when you include the like Anthropic and thinking machines, might be as big as OpenAI was.
Okay, cool. So let's take a look at some of these companies that have splintered off from the original OpenAI. And so I'd say that the first kind of category of company I want to talk about is what I'm calling like the straight shot to superintelligence neolab. And I think the first real contender here is thinking machines. And I think it's really worth spending a little bit of time on thinking machines because they've been in the news a lot lately. So Thinking Machines has as their thesis that they want to build multimodal systems that can work collaboratively with humans. Like they have this idea of like an AI model that is more customizable and accessible than many of the other frontier LMs that we've seen. They were founded in, I think 2025, I want to say, by Mira Murati, who was ex-OpenAI, along with a bunch of other famous OpenAI researchers like John Schulman, Barrett Zoff, Luke Metz, and Lillian Wang, who has like the most goated blog of history. You know what I mean? Lillian Wang is just like, you should absolutely read her blog because she has some of the most insane, just deep dives on really complicated AI topics.
She calls it Lil Log.
Lil Log, exactly. Yeah. You've been
a fan of Lil Log?
I've been a fan for a long time.
Nice.
Do you know what their product is? Have you interacted with Tinker at all?
I saw the announcement of Tinker. Yeah, it's like this API for fine-tuning base models and then serving them efficiently, right?
I think it's like, yeah, it's basically this way that you can just fine tune open source models like whatever, Llama or Quen, without having to deal with any of like the distributed infrastructure stuff that you usually have to set up when you're trying to fine tune something. I personally subscribe to it. I've never actually used it. I don't really know of many folks who are using it. But anyway, that was like their first product. They've raised, and this is the kicker, they raised a valuation of a seed round at $12 billion. And for the $12 billion valuation, they got $2 billion in cash, right? Which is insane. I guess my question to you is, do you think of them as a possible like OpenAI 2.0 contender? Because in some sense, like they are founded by many of the folks who did create DALL-E and ChatGPT. But here's the thing, like they're hemorrhaging co-founders. So like, what gives, man? Like, do you think that this is the first sort of failed Neo lab? What's your take on thinking machines insofar as you have any?
Yeah, I think it's still too early to tell, but I think thinking machines operated on the fundraising strategy to the extreme of let's assemble a really talented team of people, sign them up in writing or via casual commits, and then going out to fundraise. So you would have the money to be able to hire these people and then give them as much compute as they needed.
Yeah.
Right. And I think the way that thinking machines got these people, where an OpenAI was not able to retain them or an Anthropic was not able to hire them, was to say, we're going to keep the team really small and you truly do have access to as much compute as you want. Because the reality in these big labs, for as much as the public discourse is talking about the data centers that they're building out and how much compute is being dedicated to them, if you're an independent researcher, including some pretty senior ones in most of these big companies, you have to fight for compute access. You know, like you have to justify. You've got to pitch your superiors. You've got to say, here's the research thesis. Here's my estimate for the GPUs that we need. You really have to go to bat for your research thesis or the people under you if you're a manager in order to just get compute allocation.
Yeah.
And I think Thinking Machines was able to say, you've got it. Whatever you want to do, come here and it's yours. And I think that actually is really appealing for a lot of these researchers who are just trying to come up with some hot takes and do their own research. I think it helps that most of these people are already fabulously wealthy on paper
100%.
because of OpenAI or Anthropic or wherever they came from before. They don't really need the money. So like, I think taking a risk is kind of predicated on they don't actually have to take a risk to get the reward. They already have the reward. So now they're just doing research. But Thinking Machines was the extreme of this idea of let's just get a ton of smart people in a room and something great will happen. My understanding is that they didn't really set out in these venture pitches when they were raising the seed round, pitching a product. They really were just pitching the team.
Pitching the vibe, dude.
They were pitching the vibe. They were completely pitching the NeoLab vibe. And they basically have continued doing that. But I think judging everything with their one release that they've had so far, which is Tinker, I'm not honestly that impressed with Tinker, at least as a product offering, because you could do this fine.
Most people aren't, you know, I mean, you're probably about to say this, like, this isn't a hot take.
No, not a hot take. It's provided by a ton of other services. Replicate was one of the first ones that were on this game. That was founded by a bunch of these independent ML and engineer types.
Yeah.
Some of the people that were maybe ex-WordPress were behind this. And yeah, it was basically this idea of we have these base models, throw some data at it. If you format your JSON-L file, we'll just run these against some distributed servers and then give you back some artifact payload that you can host on our end. They did it. You can do that on SageMaker for a long time. They were kind of operating under this idea. So I think the nuance of actually what Tinker does, which is pretty technically complicated, is that they were able to figure out how to concurrently train a bunch of different models on the same architecture in a really efficient way. Mm-hmm. So I think it costs them a lot less to do this than it costs some of these other people that would have to boot up full GPU clusters for each of these fine-tuning rounds. I think also just in terms of like a technically interesting task, like it falls into that category. But in terms of something that you can articulate, like what is my value as a customer to sign up for this system, I'm not able to justify using Tinker over the 1,000 of other options that are available to do this, including honestly booting up my own GPU cluster and doing it manually.
And even if you were, like, the valuation of this company is $12 billion, this thing would have to bring in so much revenue on a revenue basis to be worth that valuation, right? I think it's important to double click on this because Hugging Face, guess the valuation of Hugging Face.
Ooh, $6 billion?
Well, it's less than 12. Yeah. Okay. I think it's like around 10 or so. But isn't that crazy to think about? That this thing that everyone uses all the day is worth less than Thinking Machines.
And I think, we're reading between the tea leaves, but like, I do think in general, if a company releases something that they've been cooking on for a while and that's a huge flop, to me, that's not the craziest bull indicator of what's going on behind the scenes. It would almost, I think, be more confidence inspiring if Thinking Machines said, we have 12 crazy architectures. we're not going to let you know until we've reached super intelligence.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
like I think that actually in some ways I would be a lot more intrigued with what they're doing behind the scenes if they had not released Tinker than if they had released Tinker. Because I'm like,
totally.
why are you spending your
What are you
cycles
guys totally.
working on fine-tuning other people's models? You know what I mean?
Totally.
What thesis is behind this?
Yeah, 100%. 100%. And I mean, here's the thing. I mean, it also to me feels like a lot of the reason that thinking machines existed is because folks were unhappy with the political structure established at OpenAI that caused many of these top engineers to just want to leave and create their own sort of framework, you know? And clearly, like, that hasn't worked out the way that they expected because Barrett Zoff and Luke Metz, like, they both returned back to OpenAI this year. So something fishy is going on, man. Where like
there's blood in the water.
There's blood in the water. And not just that, I think that there's a lot of like political infighting at a lot of these companies that we, you know, as outsiders aren't like privy to necessarily.
One speculation just on that I think I have seen with some of these neolabs is you're kind of operating in this vacuum of knowledge when you're really pitching pretty frontier paradigm shifting things in ML because you don't have a proof of concept at the get-go. And like, even if you do have a ton of GPUs, a ton of funding, there is some element of the game which is pitching your idea over other people's ideas because you can't do it all. It's like if you have a team, there are people under you that are going to be doing some of the implementing work. And if they're doing that for you, much like in a research lab, it's like they're doing that for you and not doing it for this other person. It's like the postdoc is assigned on like one thing, not like all 12 models. So I don't know. Like, I almost wonder if some of the infighting is just because of that basis alone of like, the more that you pull off the layers and reverse course to maybe where we were before transformers were really the obvious answer to scaling, like there was so much infighting among the research community as to what we should do. And if these neolabs are trying to blow the lid off of transformer architectures, I don't see why there would not be infighting in the same way, unless it's one of these personality-driven companies like maybe we'll talk about Jan LeCun's later, where there is such a top-down mandate for the technical stack that they're trying to accomplish that everyone is really rowing in the same direction. I think the trouble with recruiting one of these all-star teams is similar to in sports, where yes, everyone's great, but if you're not actually agreeing on the direction to go forward, you're just going to spend a lot of time spinning in the same direction.
It's a good point that you mentioned Jan LeCun here, because I think that a lot of these companies that are in this category of straight shot to super intelligence do kind of almost like by design have a leader at the top that is very opinionated, right? That does either believe that super intelligence is imminent or that there is some danger that we need to avoid in order for them to be the ones who develop super intelligence and not someone else who would, you know, use this for
for evil.
For evil. Yeah. Exactly. And I actually think it's funny you mentioned Jan LeCun, because famously, I would say that one of these neolabs is now Meta's superintelligence lab, right? Now kind of being led famously by Alexander Wang from Scale AI. I would say that this is like the second sort of neolab, insofar as Meta is a neolab. I mean, clearly they're not, but you know, this like subdivision, I would say, is very much of a sort of like guerrilla nature type. And they, in some sense, have been the big gorilla in the room who are capable of signing $100 million checks to poach some of these top AI scientists to come work at Meta effectively. It's interesting that Jan LeCun felt pressure to leave Meta because of what I now would assume is like partially personal misunderstandings with the direction in which Alexander Wang is trying to take the Meta Superintelligence Lab. I don't know if you have any other takes on Meta Superintelligence like broadly, but my understanding is that like, you know, the company spent a ton of money and it's not really panning out as well as we had expected maybe initially, and that there's a lot of political infighting at Meta. But I don't know, man. I mean, how are you feeling about the Meta Superintelligence like push?
I mean, I'll put it this way. If I'm taking my own medicine of what I just said, that it's probably better to not release anything at all than to release something random. Like MSL is staying pretty mum about what they're up to, which means one of two things. Either they're working on something big or they have absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
It's one of the two binaries. I don't know. I think that FAIR, which was the MSL predecessor, which stood for Facebook AI research.
So,
right?
or fundamental. I don't know. It could
yeah.
be either your Facebook or fundamental.
I think one thing that they were pretty good at was maintaining an org structure that was a lot like DeepMind's, where it was basically a bunch of independent researchers doing their own thing and exploring across different modalities. Like there was some really good CV work that came out of FAIR. There was some really good text-based processing work, some good speech-based research. So like they were kind of doing it all. Maybe even they had some like early versions of like VR, like world models for use in Oculus. But it kind of just like was the AI futuristic research group that was all under Jan LeCun. And I think that if you can establish yourself in that model, a big company actually can still be pretty lean because, you know, people aren't really rolling up to any one person to try to fulfill some business objective, which is where you typically get some bureaucracy. It's a lot more like, oh, you know, if we're viewing FAIR as the Stanford computer science department,
right?
Or like AI research department, you've got these big personalities in these profs, but like, yeah, these profs have their own teams. And sometimes like, you know, a postdoc can pitch their own research project. The hierarchy kind of works and actually makes sense. I think the only thing that might dog MSL a little bit is if they have one single goal that they're pushing for, which seems to be a language model, which is going to be like the next frontier change. I think it's just harder to organize yourself, quite honestly, in like a really big company. And in that way, these frontier labs or neo labs that are a lot smaller than MSL have some size advantage to it. But on the opposite side of the equation, there's also the fact that they have so much compute and capital associated with MSL that even at like a $2 billion seed round, I mean, Meta can pay to subsidize this indefinitely and to spin up tens or hundreds of billions of dollars worth of compute that they don't have to fundraise for. So I don't know. They've got some strong pros and they've got some strong cons.
Yeah, but then again,
we'll
like
see.
Meta is beholden to shareholders in a way that a Neolab isn't, right? And
That's a good point.
And so you've seen Meta's stock tank and rise based off of consumer sentiment, basically, right? I guess time will tell on whether or not this Meta play will actually pan out. Okay, the second group of Neolabs, I would say, after this straight shot to superintelligence, the second group I'd say is the make AI more human-like. And this one I think is the most interesting because I'm actually seeing more and more of these labs starting to pop up. So the one that is at the vanguard of the make AI human-like is Ilya's safe superintelligence. Ilya Sutskever, again, being the guy who got famously in a fight with Sam and I guess lost, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Ilya, after he got ousted from OpenAI after his failed coup, founded with Daniel Gross, who was the former Apple AI lead, this company called Safe Superintelligence. People typically abbreviate this by SSI. So they founded this company in June 2024. Their whole take is singularly the take to make AI be a safe superintelligence, right? They are like fundamentally worried that AI is going to be used for all of these nefarious purposes. And in fact, like this was the whole reason that Ilya and Sam, I think, got in this kerfuffle in the first place, is because there's a whole group of researchers at OpenAI that were afraid of the direction that Sam was taking the company in. They really saw AI as capable of producing something inherently dangerous, right? And so Ilya's whole like guiding purpose in life is to create this like safe superintelligence. Ergo, the name of the company, Safe Superintelligence. So
yeah, truth in advertising.
It goes a little bit deeper than that. I think Ilya has famously said that he believes that the age of scaling is ending, and this is something that Jan LeCun has also said, which basically means that he believes that Safe Superintelligence, this lab, will need to develop new learning methods that will make intelligence fundamentally safer. So the take here is basically to create a small team of like SEAL Team 6 of AI researchers that can work on really frontier, different types of learning paradigms, things that no other big lab is investing in, stuff at the fringe of AI research. And with a small team of people, create this model that is fundamentally safer and that will lead us to AGI in a defensible and safe way. So they are valued at, and get this, $32 billion. So if we thought thinking machines was a lot at $12 billion, they're at $32 billion as of last year. So who knows what their valuation is now? But again, like we're talking some serious dinero here, right? Unlike thinking machines, no product that we're aware of. So here's my question to you, man. Like, do you think you can build superintelligence with a team of 20 people and just like vibes? Or does like the fact that they're worth $32 billion on zero revenue kind of like represent the fact that we've like peaked in terms of AI bullishness and like AI froth? Like, is this as bad as it gets?
I mean, you're gonna need a hell of a lot of vibes, dude. You're gonna have to be
How many
heavy on the
vibes is $32 billion
At least a few. At least a few vibes. I mean, look, I said that I'm bullish on small teams. I think I maintain that. For $32 billion, there's a way to read this, which is just the capital market side of things. And then there's a way to read the potential here. I think to answer your question, no, I don't think you're going to be able to achieve super intelligence with 20 people in a valuation of 32 billion, especially when you're up against these big dogs where there's such porous information sharing across companies, and you're against companies that have the compute resources, have just way more talent in like raw numerics. They're also really great. It's not like SSI has people that are 10x every other engineer that's at Anthropic or OpenAI. I think maybe there's some justification baked in this that depending on the industries they target first, this might be a little bit more palatable. Where from what I've heard, they're not going necessarily after the superintelligence play as the first thing they do, right? I think that they're trying to go after these very lucrative markets of like law, finance, things that, are obviously addressed by the big players, but maybe Anthropic is a little bit too horizontal. I think a valuation like that would not necessarily be crazy depending on like how you do the modeling for the underlying market. But I do think what it is reflective of is the fact that we're kind of jumping like 2 or 3 valuation rounds when we're actually pinning these companies, where we used to say, a conservative, maybe like 20x of like what you currently have. That's going to be like a seed valuation. And then each round you kind of get closer to reality, maybe even like 50x of your seed. But like you kind of
in terms of revenue.
Yeah, in terms of revenue.
Yeah.
You basically like compress it over time as you get closer and closer to like a public market comp. Because the further along you go, the expectations are ratcheted up. And it's like you're effectively operating as a public company because you no longer have this hope of the future being far different. You're being valued at the present. And I think valuing yourself at that high of a dollar value when you don't have any revenue, regardless of what your pitch deck says about the kind of industries you want to go after, is just so unsupported by your actual book of business that I don't think you can really do it, practically speaking.
So at some point you need to have real money coming in to justify.
I think you either need that or a show of very clear progress against the superintelligence direction, but I think it's one or the other. Like I think you either have to say, we are going to launch a very profitable product that has some different point of view than the frontier labs do, or we have an initial prototype which is compelling enough on the loss curves or the efficiency or something to say, value us this highly and also pour this much more money into us training a proper frontier model, because the next time you hear from us is going to be superintelligence.
And that's the crazy thing about this business pitch. It's like the first person to crack superintelligence, insofar as it exists, has won the game, right? If you're the first to really get to AGI, assume that is actually plausible. If SSI were, for whatever reason, the player to actually get there and really create some safe superintelligence, it's kind of over, right? It's like a 0 or 1. And so I suppose like if you have a VC that really buys this vision that you are the one who can like, uniquely create a real safe AGI, then in some sense, what is the valuation of that? It's kind of impossible to pin down, right? But I do want to say like things aren't looking so great. So apparently like Meta tried to acquire them last year. They said no. And then Daniel Gross left to join Meta. So one of the co-founders is
They acquired him.
They acquired him. That's what it seems like. So I don't know if that bodes well or doesn't bode well for SSI, but it does feel like things might be a little less stable than they might seem.
Yeah. Quick tangent. Have you seen the merch that they sell?
No.
Maybe this is third party, but Ilya had a tweet where he retweeted someone that made a mouse pad, which was just his bald spot.
Yeah, Ilya's bald spot is really an institution, dude. Like that has,
which is really funny.
His bald spot has like become a personality.
Yeah. And I think it said SSI on the bottom.
That's incredible.
So I mean, a non-zero part of Tesla's revenue is their swag shop that you can get online.
Is that true?
I mean, it's not zero.
Would you wear an SSI cap if I buy you one?
For the next episode of the pod, sure, buddy. Yeah, right. I'd wear it. For
Not saying that I will.
No. But hypothetically.
Moving on from SSI, the other big one that dropped maybe, I want to say like December of last year. So like a month and a half ago. Humans and spelled humans, ampersand. Okay. The reason that this was insane is because this company effectively brought on the whole Stanford CS department to be co-founders of this company.
Uh-huh.
So on my Twitter feed, I had like 30 people all saying, happy to announce that I have joined this new startup. I will be taking a temporary leave, or I am partially now part-time at this startup. So they have a ton of Stanford CS pros working here. They raised $480 million seed. Again, no product.
But
free
conservative
money.
compared to thinking machines.
I mean,
only 480 million. Rich.
Only 408, only $500 million at a valuation of just shy of $5 billion. And their thesis, again, being in this category of make AI more human-like companies, is we think that current AI is all IQ, no EQ. We want models that have more emotional intelligence. So that means like the ability to infer users' intents, understand long-term preferences. We want models that are more like teammates, right? Rather than these things that you just kind of like force to do your stuff and don't really interact with very much. I mean, it's absolutely insane. This company is 2 months old. We have absolutely no sense of like whether or not this will succeed. If you were a VC, would you give $500 million to a company that is all CS profs? Like, do you think CS profs are the right type of candidate startup founder that you would want to give your money to? What do you think is the play here for VCs?
I mean, I think it depends which Stanford prof.
Sure.
Chris Ray's obviously been very successful with his previous endeavors. And he also sits on like 20 boards right now of companies that his lab starts. So I think it depends on the prof. But I actually think that within that statement, there's an observation that actually I think Chris Ray is seen as kind of like a unique case at Stanford, that his lab always produces companies that end up doing pretty interesting things and that often end up being profitable. Like I think Cartesia ended up coming out of his lab.
Yep.
Snorkel also came out of there. So there's this notion of like it's a combination of like practical AI plus engineering prowess built up into some financial instrument that actually does kind of make sense from more of a corporate POV. Most of the other labs don't have that reputation at Stanford. And I think when you have a bunch of different profs, you kind of run this risk that I was mentioning before, where it's just like too many cooks in the kitchen. It's like too many people kind of with like contradictory, decisions. There's going to be like jockeying for power, whatever. The thing that like makes being a professor so nice, I think, is that you have your own fiefdom, and suddenly you're telling people to share their fiefdom with other people. I guess question for you, Rich, since I know you keep in touch with a lot of these folks, was this research out of at least one lab that was at Stanford, or was this a thesis that just in general existed and then they poach all of these Stanford profs to help execute the vision? Like, it's a little weird that there is such concentration of talent from one academic institution if that didn't originate from the research that they were doing internally.
I will say that I think Stanford is somewhat unique insofar as the relationship between the CS department, the neuroscience department, the cog sci department, it's all kind of a little amorphous. Like they all kind of blend together. For instance, there's a professor, Noah Goodman and Michael Frank, who are both like kind of like neuroscientist-y folks, but also work in the CS department. And it's like a little like ambiguous, like what exact group to like order them into. I've worked with some other profs that really are kind of at the intersection of sociology, anthropology, and computer science. So Stanford tends to be very interdisciplinary as far as the university goes, and they make it really easy for you to collaborate across departments, which means that if there were to be a company founded to make AI more human-like, more of a better teammate, more something that is akin to how, humans would interact with each other, it would kind of make sense that it would come out of one of these interdisciplinary groups where profs are interacting with each other across these different disciplines. If you look at the folks working there, like it is really a lot of these interdisciplinary profs that are on the list of founders. I mean, right now I'm looking at this in front of me. We got Noah Goodman, who he's the guy I just mentioned, right? I've worked with Dee Yang before. She's also kind of like at this intersection between sort of sociology and computer science. So I think it makes sense as far as, who these founders are that they would want to create this kind of a company. The question is like, I haven't seen a white paper from them yet. I don't think this is the result of some research that they've all collaboratively worked on. I think this is the result of conversations that these pros have had with one another, wanting to create AI that is a little bit more like a reimagined version of what AI could be in the best possible case. And I think these folks all genuinely care about AI being safer in some broader, more like amorphous sense, right? I think that there is this concern that the current direction of AI is leading to a world in which these machines could really take over people's jobs in some detrimental way that is catastrophic. And I think that these professors are genuinely, have like a fervently held desire to make AI more safe, whatever that means, right? And the problem is like we don't really know what safe AI means because in some sense we don't really know what AI fundamentally like is capable of, right? We've seen some of the dangers of AI when we see like AI like proposing how to create a atomic bomb or something like that. But to a certain extent, like as far as we're aware, there hasn't been a robot that's killed many humans yet. Right? Like as in so far, like what
Yeah, to know what's safe, you almost have to know what's unsafe about it.
like you have to position yourself, I think, in contrast to the unsafeness that is OpenAI or Anthropic, right? You have to say we are the safer version of that. And it begs the question, like, are these companies fundamentally unsafe, right? Or like, what would you do differently from these companies? And I think that there is no clear answer to that question, right? So I guess again, like,
so
time will tell.
you wouldn't give them $480 million.
I mean, here's the thing, man. Like, I just don't. I think the question is ill posed. Like, I don't think we understand what it means to build safe AI yet.
Yeah.
I think we know what it means to build someone more interpretable AI, which is what Anthropic is trying to do. And I think insofar as interpretability is a version of safer AI, I think that is a plausible thesis, right? So like if you say in order to build safe AI, we have to understand what it's doing and we need to do research into that. I think that makes sense. And that's kind of what Anthropic is trying to do. But creating AI that is more emotionally like aware, I don't really know what that means. I don't think anyone really does.
Yeah, I think I'm with you. I think you also have to think about who do they sell this to? Is this a consumer product? And therefore they're going against the obvious incumbents in the space, which is OpenAI and Google that have built-in distribution channel to millions or billions of people already. If they're going after enterprises, you're going to have to spin up some sales function to compete against the other incumbents, maybe compete on quality, if not on the price. It's really tricky. I think it's like easy to under imagine how difficult a company is to like really get off the ground that's separate from the research itself. And I do think that if you're in a very like researchy world, it seems like the research is the most important part. I think the reality boots on the ground is like the market around you and the business decisions you make are usually the more important part of making sure it's successful or not. It seems almost obvious to me that all of these VCs are trying to place a diversity of bets on multiple of these companies. And I think they're hoping that it will pay out regardless because they'll just get acquired.
Yeah.
Like if this ends up being a flop, they'll have some return on capital. That's usually not how VCs like to think about their funds because they're looking for a couple. They're basically like whale hunters.
You're looking for the 10x, the
you're
100x.
You're really looking for 100x in order to like make an individual fund vintage pay out. You're looking for like one or two of those per fund. So unclear if that's going to be the 100 bagger that they're really looking for. I think if I was a betting man, I'd say it's probably not. But in the current environment, you also have some like kind of warped venture incentives because if you have a really talented team, that does make for a dramatically more appealing acquisition target on behalf of these big companies that actually do have the coffers to be able to pay cash or pay stock. And like that itself kind of ends up maybe being a vehicle to get on the cap table of some of these big companies or like a preferred, entry point. If they invest in a company and that company gets rolled up, so converts your equity in them into equity in another company.
Yeah, so many like side games are happening.
Yeah, there's a lot of financing side games of specifically the equity in these like roll-up vehicles and the secondary marketplace that founders and early employees can get as part of these rounds as well.
So interesting.
Yeah.
So interesting. Okay, Pierre. So that's the second category of neolabs. Now we're going to go to the ones that I'm personally, and I mean, I'll say it, I think I'm a little bit more excited about. And these would be what I would call the hot take neolabs, like the neolabs that are based off of some research vision or some sort of a thesis grounded in a new way of doing language modeling. So I would call these like the different architecture labs. And here there are really two sort of like front runners that you might have heard of. The one that I want to start off with is by talking about Sakana AI. Have you heard about these folks?
No.
You haven't heard about? Okay.
Yeah.
They are kind of like the dark horse of the neolabs. They're not based in the Bay Area. They're based in Tokyo, which is, first of all, like pretty interesting. They were founded by David Ha and Leon Jones, who were, I believe, originally at Google. They were also on the Attention is All You Need paper. I think both of these folks worked for Google AI in Tokyo before leaving, raised a ton of money. Their whole take is to develop AI methods that are somewhat more biologically inspired than the classical transformer model, right? So it's kind of ironic. Like these folks were on the original transformer paper.
Yeah.
Now they're trying to create models that
Jettisoning
aren't
it, doing something else.
transformers.
Yeah.
But so a lot of the research coming out of this lab is looking at evolutionary methods. So basically methods that don't just do back propagation on a bunch of data for infinite time steps, but rather try to think about how can we redesign the training paradigm that we use to train these models? Can we make the training paradigm a little bit more akin to how a human child learns language? They've also thought about things like collective intelligence and what they're calling model breeding. So kind of like having models emerge from like this evolutionary process where models like compete with one another, and eventually like a better model just kind of like naturally emerges as a result of these models fighting against each other, kind of like in a, Darwinian sense almost. So this is like their approach. I personally have not seen a clear product come out of Sakana that you or I would use, but it's an interesting paradigm shift. And so I'm curious, like, do you kind of buy it? I mean, do you buy that there's some alpha to be gained in not doing transformers, in exploring like these more fringe, like evolutionary training paradigms, things that aren't just back propagating on a maximum likelihood estimation loss function?
I mean, I guess I'm not really clear on how that invalidates a transformer architecture at the base level. Like, it almost feels like they're trying to play around with how do you fuse weights across generations of different architectures. They're trying to explore within one generation of architectures, how do you get this data to actually change the weights in a more efficient way? So like optimizer theory. It seems like you could apply both of those to transformer architectures the same that you could to a state space model. It's just like these primitives that you're applying in novel ways. I think I would be cautious of trying to change too much when you're doing one of these research labs where, like, yes, it's definitely interesting. I think model architectures that better approximate what we know to be basically the only existence proof of intelligence, which is the human brain, or maybe other kind of mammalian brains, is a smart place to start. I don't know if I would have the guts myself to jettison all of the existing research that we have, because like a transform at the very level, especially with attention, is kind of like a universal function approximator. Like we can show it actually empirically that it can learn basically anything because itself can act as basically anything. I think if you try to do too much too early, it's just classic research 101 that you've got to isolate the independent variable a little bit. So, internally, I bet they're doing that. They're probably exploring a wide range of stuff, but there's something about the scope of this particular one that gives me a little bit of pause of like, do you really think we're not even close to AGI and therefore we have to do everything from scratch? If so, you're going to need way more capital than they've raised in order to even like have a POC.
Yeah, totally. I think they're tapping into this desire to explore new methods because fundamentally we've been using the same approaches for the last 10 years almost, right? Like transformers, the atom optimizer, word piece tokenization. Like these are things that have been around for basically a decade at this point, effectively unchanged. Modulo some like little, additions or updates to these approaches, but like the actual underlying way that we've trained models hasn't changed for 10 years, which is crazy to think about, especially if you're a lay person who's not involved in this tech. It feels like there's been this massive transformation when the reality couldn't be further from the truth. Like the methods that we studied in 2016 are still basically the same as what's being used nowadays. And, the kicker is like, for the longest time, people have been thinking about how can you train models in a way that is more human-like? And there's a tension where like every time we've tried to train something that it learns in the way that a human brain learns, those methods tend to not work as well as some of these like more basic naive methods that we tend to use. Like people have looked at, can you try to model the way that synapses like interact with each other via coding that into a computer in some clever way? And that tends to not really ever work. Like at least I have had a really hard time in my own research getting these things to work. Like there's this thing known as meta learning. And here the idea is that you train a model, not on a specific task, but you train it on effectively like infinite amounts of tasks. You basically create a new task every time you take a learning update step on this model. You train it on a brand new task. And from scratch, at every time step, the model has to learn how to solve this new task. And you do that 100,000 times. So the model has to 100,000 times learn how to solve a new task. And at the end of that process, the model has not learned how to solve one task particularly well, but it's learned how to solve any task in general pretty well. So that's the idea of meta learning. You like learn how to learn a task. And these models are just like impossible to train. It's really hard to get them to work well. It's a cool idea in theory because it kind of replicates how the human brain can adapt to any task and can learn the general process of how to learn effectively. Like the human brain has this ability to introspect and kind of like become good, at learning something. Like if you're good at playing football, like it's not that hard for you to learn how to play basketball or how to play any other sport because you have these like primitives that allow you how to learn something like a second time in an easier way. But it just doesn't work if you implement it in a computer very well. Like these things are really hard to get right.
Yeah, and I guess it's one of these things where it's hard to say what we don't know. Like it's hard to say what might work better. And is it a case where this is basically like a CPU, right? Where the instruction set for most modern CPUs are like pretty unchanged over the past 20 years, if not longer than that, because they worked well enough and they did what we needed them to do. So we moved on to more interesting parts of the stack. I guess for some of these like really fundamental things like, gradient descent or atom optimizer or even transformer architectures as a whole, although I think that there is more opportunity for innovation on that side of things, like how much of this is just because these things work well enough on like a very basic mathematics level to let us then do more interesting things that we actually don't need to change them versus this is like the core primitive that if we have an unlock here, this will improve everything downstream because it's so core to the paradigm that we're using. I guess you'll never know until you find something better. But my own like gut feel is the fact that these things have stayed so ubiquitous since they were started. I really don't know how much more juice there is to squeeze on like the atom optimizer, because even when you look at new age things like muon, it's all kind of in the same ballpark.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You're not finding like fundamentally different lost territories. You're always kind of in the same ballpark. Or if you run these on like more epochs or with like more gradient normalization, it usually gets to the same place. So, color me interested, but it does feel like one of these things where it's like, it's so seductive of a pitch that if you like change these primitives, you're going to end up with something wildly different. And I don't think it's for lack of trying. Like I think like really smart people have been working on some of these questions for a really long time and have not gotten there. And like the chances that these two guys, however talented, are going to be the ones to finally crack the code seems like a bet that maybe I would take as like a grant writer for a school, but not as like a VC.
You wouldn't put real money behind this.
I don't think so.
Yeah. I mean, in this vein, if you didn't like Sakana, you're not going to like flapping airplanes.
Okay.
I don't know if you heard about them. They dropped last month. They also made a pretty big splash. Flapping airplanes is very much in the same spirit as Sakana. Their idea is basically looking at taking inspiration from the fact that the human brain is very data efficient. So, by the age of 13, a child has only seen about 100 million words. That could contrast that with a language model, which typically sees on the order of 10 trillion to 100 trillion words. And you very quickly realize, oh my God, language models are seeing about 100,000 times more data than humans do. And in some sense, like a 13-year-old child speaks English just fine, right? And is like just as conversational as a language model. Doesn't have maybe the knowledge built in, but it has the conversational abilities. So how the hell can humans do it so well? So Flapping Airplanes is basically this company founded by a couple of PhDs from Stanford, also co-founder from Neuralink, who are looking at, can we basically try to take inspiration from how humans learn and encode that into a language model? And so we don't have to say much more about that, in part because this company is literally 2 weeks old. But the point is that there is appetite for these sorts of bets, and it's interesting that VCs are very happy to fund these things, right? That are kind of built off of this vision, this dream that we will get to a world in which language models will be built in a way that more closely parallels how the human brain is structured.
Totally. Which, I mean, I actually would put these in slightly different categories because I think in some ways, to me, the Flapping Airplanes pitch is a little bit more targeted than Sakana in that we actually do have this observational proof of the stat that you just said, which is like the human brain is ultra efficient. Language models right now typically are not that efficient. But we have seen initial research that show that you can make language models way more efficient by changing the quality of data that you give it, right? Like that is a pretty well-known fact. It's like if you can really just isolate one of these hypotheses to say we are a neolab that is working on data efficiency, I think that is actually a rich territory in which you can explore as a research problem. here's an observation that we have about the human brain. Here's a branch of research that is already existing and shows initial promise. We're going to try to take this from like, N to like N+5 of where it's been historically. And like, here's a point of view on like how we think we might approach it, at least as like a V1 and V2. So that's my take. And I think in that way, these more efficient LLMs are a little bit more well-scoped, which I like. I think you're still taking a bet on both the team, technology, and the research, which statistically are not likely to pay out just, if you look at like individual research. But I think they stand more of a chance than if you like really have a pie in the sky view and then you end up, just whiffing it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And actually, I mean, there is a different type of NeoLab in this category. I would put Inception labs as part of this, which are these labs that are looking at a very specific type of model architecture because they believe it can solve a specific type of problem. So Inception labs, their thesis is to not use autoregressive models for language modeling, but rather to be the lab that really goes deep on diffusion models. And we've talked about diffusion models before. I mean, it might be worth just kind of briefly explaining what a diffusion model is for the sake of this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, there is text diffusion, there's image diffusion. They're actually fully different constructs. But in the case of text diffusion, I kind of think of it as like you have a paragraph that you just allocate space to in some buffer or on some page. And at each time step, say maybe we have a budget of 50 time steps, you can tweak every word in this sequence and only keep the things that look approximately right. Internally, that's of course modeled as like a confidence interval, but you can kind of view this like permutation over time as you're converging from this very rough cut where maybe if you're asking for a paragraph about Paris, you start with like referencing Paris and the Eiffel Tower and the Arc de Triomphe.
Yeah.
And you put that all kind of in this soup. And then the words in between are kind of gibberish, but you're like, all right, that's like the core of probably what I want to say. The next time step, it gets a little bit clearer and words around that fill in. But at each time step, you're actually fully rewriting the whole paragraph, basically, until you end up with something that's good.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good explanation. It's kind of like, it's like an Etch-a-Sketch almost, right? Where like, the more you, I guess it's like the opposite of Etch-a-Sketch. With an Etch-a-Sketch, like you shake it and it like deletes it. But imagine like the opposite process where were you to like shake it, you would get like an image that like all of a sudden kind of like, shows up from this blankness. Like that's kind of like what a diffusion model is. It's like out of nothing, like all of a sudden you get this like emergent output that is, in this case, like tokens appearing all at once. And so again, like the take here is basically like if you used a diffusion model, you could in theory generate tokens much faster, right? And to some extent, like it does work. Like I think we have our first working prototypes of diffusion models that came out last year. And we talked about it, I think, on the show.
Yeah.
For the longest time, like text diffusion was kind of like one of these like holy grail things where we thought that if we would be able to crack it, that might be the next frontier of language model. It doesn't seem to me like it's really taken hold though, right? I think we have seen diffusion models come out of Google recently, like the Google diffusion, the text diffusion model, but it still seems like the autoregressive model still is king, right?
Yeah.
It's like still the top dog. And that's interesting. And this kind of like, dovetails with our conversation about are transformer like autoregressive models like the best it gets, like this core primitive that's kind of hard to beat? Did we get lucky and just kind of like invent the right framing and like the right foundational architecture for like modeling language, or is something going to replace it? I don't know. And it's unclear. So Inception Labs has come out with this Mercury model, which generates a bunch of tokens at once, as said, as opposed to autoregressive models. I personally haven't used it. Have you used this Mercury model?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, me neither.
I think I saw a demo of how fast it was. I was like, oh, that's cool.
Yeah, exactly. I think I had about the same reaction as you. Unlike some of the other labs, they raised $50 million from Menlo Ventures, and their investors include Karpathy, who is like the ex of AI at Tesla, and Andrew Ng, who is our professor famously of
famously. So that's mostly what it's known for.
Well, he's like famously like the guy who created CS229 at Stanford.
Yeah, totally. And also like
everyone kind of knows, and Cartoon
yeah.
and Coursera, right? Like all these companies.
Coursera.
Yeah. But it's interesting. I mean, it does feel like if I were a VC, putting money into Inception Labs would be like a good, fun, contrarian bet, I think. Like a hedge kind of. Right?
Yeah. I'll put it this way. It's like, I think that there is this desire among the research community for VCs to back some architectures. I think that'd be cool. That like sounds nice on paper, where it's just, hey, we have some idea, give me some funding to like do something.
Totally.
I think that's not really where venture shines. Like most venture capitalists don't really come from the research world. And even the ones that do, or ex-engineers, are no better place to choose what is going to be a more successful bet than anyone else. I think everyone's just kind of like throwing darts at a certain point. So
It's a spray and pray tactic for a lot of these VCs.
it very much
Yeah.
is. I just feel like there's inherent risk almost. And like, if you really have some strong thesis on an architecture and that architecture doesn't play out, are you going to continue to try to chase that architecture to make it work? Or are you going to pivot into doing something which is actually profitable as a business?
And I mean, like, if your whole company is based off of like a research thesis, like that is, imagine if it's not working out, what do you do then?
Yeah, I think you basically have, I think of all companies as either having technical risk or market risk or both. Where the technical risk is like, if we can do this thing, people will pay us for it because it's just trivial. Like,
Yeah.
if you develop a better high frequency trading algorithm, people will obviously pay for that because you literally make people more money, right? Other end of the extrema is like, the technical risk is pretty trivial, like making a new social network, but actually marketing that and getting people to use it is where the difficulty comes in.
Yep.
Most companies are like kind of a mix of both. I think the technical risk companies are usually the ones that get more engineers excited about them because it feels like solving a hard technical nut. But I think the difficulty with a lot of these neo labs is they have both immense technical risk and they also have immense market risk.
Totally.
Where, okay, if you've somehow you've done it, not super intelligence, but you've done something else that's like immensely impressive. Is there enough of a market for like a low latency solution that you can sell your frontier model that is diffusion based to somebody? Like, I don't know if they're asking these questions, but I certainly would be if I start one or I join one. You know, I think that these would be pretty important. I think they're just missing from the pitch decks right now.
And I tend to agree with you. So, but anyway, so that kind of sums up the third kind of category of Neolab. So again, to summarize, we got 1, the straight shot to super intelligence; 2, the make AI more human-like; and 3, now what we just talked about, the more efficient LLM or the different architectures LLM kind of labs.
Yeah.
Right. All right. The fourth,
we've got so many neo labs.
We have so many. And that's why I wanted to talk about this. And it feels like we are absolutely swamped right now with all these neo labs.
This is a Cambian explosion.
What the hell is going on? Like someone, I kind of feel like my brain likes to categorize things. That's why I have all these different spreadsheets for my personal life. You know, I like to put things into neat categories. With these neo labs, it just feels like there's a new one every single day. It's hard to mentally even like compartmentalize, like, what are you doing that's different, you know?
Yeah.
So for me, this was a very useful exercise. The fourth type of neolab, I would say, are the neolabs that are really focusing on a specific task or a specific modality. So I would say that these are the, famously like the coding agent neolabs, like AnySphere, famously the makers of Cursor; Cognition, also a coding agent neolab, as well as neolabs that focus on voice first, sort of like text to speech or speech to text sort of modality. So these would be 11 Labs, Cartesia, which is mentioned before. What do you think about these sorts of labs, Pierce? I mean, do you think that if you were a VC, you would more likely back one of these labs that has sort of a very specific sort of modular focus on a specific task or modality?
Yeah, I think I would. My own investment thesis is always you need to know what kind of target customer you're pitching to and really hone in, ideally with a land and expand, where you get one group of people, they love it, really proves out that it works, and then you expand to other people. I think there's like, the risk of boiling the ocean that a lot of startups can kind of wind themselves into. I don't think Cursor is ever going to make an image model or spend their resources doing so. They're like, we just want to be the best coding ones possible. And you kind of have a built-in distribution pipeline to people that are going to use it, i.e. the software developers, which are going to use your front end. I think in voice, like 11 Labs and Cartesia are kind of duking it out. I think Cartesia is kind of this interesting case where it's a bunch of these researchers who, again, were at Stanford, had this thesis around state space models, but because state space models don't have the kind of memory that transformers do, it's actually a better fit for speech models because you don't have to keep this context history in the same kind of fidelity that you would for coding. So they kind of like found their use case. I don't know which came first, chicken or the egg, but like my sense is they had the model and they were like, where is this going to be best applied? It's probably going to be for speech. And they've ended up being very successful because of it. I think at the end of the day, it like depends on the team and depends on how much focus the big labs are giving to this area. Because I do think actually right now, AnySphere has a pretty existential risk from just Claude and OpenAI.
Yeah.
Because if you jump the paradigm and you don't need a coding interface anymore, and you just are using CLI tools, you don't really need Cursor as
You
an
don't need an
interface.
IDE. You're kind of
That's
done.
bingo. You don't need an IDE.
Yep.
So then AnySphere, they can only challenge the frontier labs by training their own language model, which they're actually doing, right? Like
they have one.
They train some unique from scratch AnySphere model, which is, cheaper than some of the other ones. But you're kind of seeing them having to compete on this like language model to language model basis of they've got to get some access, either like accuracy or latency that's better than the big dogs. And that's like a tough game to play. I mean, it's really hard to go up against companies with way more compute, way more data, and way more subsidy availability than you are as a small company. So I'd be a little risky the second that like, it's kind of like Zoran's eye a little bit in Lord of the Rings, right? Where like, you really don't.
You want to hide from that eye.
You really don't want it looking
at
you, dog.
Yeah.
Like the second that eye kind of tilts to your modality, I think you're in for a kind of tough time.
Unless you have some crazy moat that you can build up because of some sort of weird, either like legalistic process, like you have access to some data that no one else can have, or you have some sort of like a unique bespoke solution to the problem that no one else would like to invest in, like Cartesia, for instance, right? I don't know how much the folks at OpenAI would want to really double down on state space models. And if you can build enough of an advantage over that and have some proprietary state space model that it would take OpenAI maybe a year to try to develop with their in-house engineers, that might also be a decent moat for you.
Especially if that then lets you get the flywheel going to get more data, get more customers, become more of an expectation. Yeah, I think it's really like a land grab territory for a lot of these where, to the Cartesia case, I actually don't really think it matters if they rip state space models or they rip transformers, so long as they like find their niche user and they get more speech data. I think they probably could have like started a successful company doing transformer speech models as well, just because that's been like a second or third tier OpenAI priority. And Anthropic, again, doesn't really seem to care about it as much as some of the other things. So I think you've got to get lucky, I think, in some sense of like, in some ways, we're critical path for some businesses to achieve what they want to achieve, but we're like not critical path for the objectives of OpenAI or Anthropic, because otherwise they're just going to build it themselves. It's a tough needle to thread.
It's a tough needle to thread, and I would be kind of quaking in my boots a little bit.
Yeah.
And to wrap it up, Group 5, I would be remiss if we didn't mention them, the good old Spatial World Labs. And we talked about this last episode, but it really feels like there's two big contenders right now. The first one is World Labs. This is Fei-Fei's lab, and we've talked about them a little bit before. And they're the ones who are trying to create these like really large LLM equivalent world models that can perceive, generate, and interact with 3D environments. They actually have a product out called Marble. I think we might have looked at them in a previous episode. Now, Marble, you can think about it like Genie in some sense. So if you take a look at our YouTube, we actually just recently released a little play-by-play demo of us using the new Genie model that Google came out with. But it's this idea that you can basically create almost like a video game that can simulate the real world, and you can interact with this real world like you would in a video game by walking around, taking a look at stuff. On the fly, it basically generates this world for you. And Fei-Fei, also known as like the godmother of AI, she's the one who kind of created the ImageNet challenge in the early 2000s.
Worked at Google for a long time. At
Stanford for a long time. Her PhDs, I think Justin Johnson, and I don't know if Ben Mildenhall was also her PhD, but anyway, they're the founders of this World Lab thing. They seem to be doing, as well as any of the other entrants in the space. They might be maybe at the very top of the contenders along with Google's Genie models. I mean, their whole pitch is that if language models solve understanding text, world models solve understanding the physical space. Do you buy that? Like, do you think that we can think about world models like LLMs for the physical space, or is this kind of like a different abstraction that we should be thinking about?
I think one thing that's really interesting about the foundational model game for world models is that there are so many competing architecture choices, because it's actually not something that transformers are obviously going to be best at, right? The second that you're introducing all of these 3D notions, you start getting yourself into territories where you say, hey, maybe actually the objective of the ML model is to render us the definition of, polygons that we can render in some 3D environment. But the model itself doesn't really have to be aware of the gravity or like the physical basis so long as it can define into something that's a little bit more deterministic, this is how it should show up in space. There's a whole other branch, which is kind of like the Genie models that are just saying, we're doing from scratch generation of like frame by frame. You interact with it. That's basically text instructions for the model that tell it the next frames to generate based on what it's seen before. I think Genie is at least rumored to be a transformer model, if not outrightly confirmed to be one. So there's just a lot more, I think, open territory for these companies to explore a little bit more, because it's not obvious exactly which modality or which mode of thinking about this problem is going to be the one that ends up winning out. So I think in terms of like starting a company, that one is probably the most interesting from like a modeling POV. And I actually could see some company coming up with a hot take or some fusion of these two different views that really does work. And, we're looking back and saying, hey, this really solved the question of world models, at least for use in downstream applications. I think the bigger question for me, going back to the financing side as I want to do, is who's going to buy these things? Because it's probably not going to be individual consumers. I can't really see that.
I mean, we played around with Genie. Like, I don't think we'd be paying $200 anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, well, we did. So we threw $200 at them.
Maybe
for
we are the
POC.
consumers.
Yeah, it's a bunch of podcasters.
Exactly.
It's like, I don't see video game manufacturers buying these yet. I can't really see video gamers buying them yet. Maybe in like multiple iterations from now, you're starting to get a little bit closer to that kind of world. But I think it's like really immediately useful to generate data for other ML systems, at which point it's probably the big labs that want access to some of these things. That is also a risk vector for you as a company existentially, because like if you raise your prices enough, why wouldn't this company just do it themselves?
Totally.
They obviously have access to the same or similar kind of data. There's not really a flywheel here in which like you get more data by making more world simulations. I guess you have like more prompts that people want shown. Yeah. So I think the world model game is one where like the market question is like maybe more pronounced than it is for the other players. But like in some ways, the technical question is maybe a little bit less salient, because like we know that these things exist and can work pretty well.
Yeah, they work pretty well.
They already work today.
I think the proof of concept is there. Like these things aren't just a pipe dream. Like
totally.
We will have a really good world model before 2030, I think.
Yeah.
The question is, like, as you said, like, is it going to be video game studios buying this? Is it going to be, film studios buying these? Is it going to be companies like Wave or like Tesla that want to generate, better self-driving cars that are going to buy these to simulate, driving conditions? Like, it's unclear, man. It is telling that there's like a lot of interest and appetite by some of these, godmothers and godfathers of AI to invest in this. I mean, Feifei built World Labs. We have Jan LeCun now quitting Meta to build his own World Lab model. So time will tell, man. But there's clearly like a new market opening up for these. Who the customers are going to be is kind of the big question mark.
Yeah, this does kind of feel like the sexy new modality.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like all the other ones, there are enough entrants. We like have some good proof of concepts. Enterprises are even starting to use them. That's true for video. That's true for photos. That's true for audio. That's true for text. World models? Not yet.
Model of the world? Not
model
yet.
of the world? Not yet. It's coming soon.
It's coming soon.
Yet.
Coming soon to a movie theater near you.
Yeah, PS5,
maybe
PS8
PS5 near you.
Yeah,
who knows?
Maybe
yeah,
we'll see.
Well, that about sums it up, boss. We got these 5 different groups. We have this dozen different companies. I hope that helped a little bit. It helped myself a little bit sort of compartmentalize these things.
It's kind of nuts. You hear about these so piecemeal whenever they have their fundraising, and then I feel like they go dark, that you don't really consider how many of them are coexisting in the same timeline, but they're all around us.
They're all around us.
They're all around us. They're doing something.
And their coffers are full with cash now.
Yeah.
Some of them are going to survive. Some of them are probably going to lose investors a ton of money, and to the extent to which there is an AI bubble, I mean, these guys are the ones who are responsible for it. This is what we talk about when there's an AI bubble. Like the fact that these folks are getting this much funding is a real existential question for a lot of us here in the Bay Area. Like, are they going to be successful? Are they not? We'll have to see in 5 years.
It's gonna be easier to find an apartment if they're not successful. Rich.
That's true, man.
If all of these pop off.
But if they're not successful, then I'm out of a job, maybe. Though,
yeah,
So
touche.
Potato. We'll see what happens.
We'll see what happens. Great deep dive, man. Yeah, thanks for prepping this.
Of course, boss, and thanks for entertaining me.
Anytime.
By going through this subject material with me, boss.
Definitely. Well, we're off next week.
Yeah,
but we've actually got a very fun interview that we're going to be
Ooh.
dropping. So I won't tease it anymore, but still stay tuned in the pre-trained pod feed since we have that going. And I'll see you the week after.
See you on the flip side, boss.
Yeah, later, man.
Alrighty, bye.